What if I told you that in 1900 you could hire a maid for just $4 a month? That's less than what we pay for a cup of coffee today. But before you start wishing for a time machine, there's more to this story. Life in 1900 wasn't all cheap services and low prices. We're about to reveal the surprising truth about the cost of living back then and how it compares to today. Get ready for some eye-opening facts that will change how you see your great-grandparents' era. Ever wondered what life was like for a young factory worker in 1900? Let's step into John's shoes and experience a day in his life where every penny counts and dreams seem just out of reach. Meet John, our 22-year-old protagonist, as he rubs the sleep from his eyes at 5 a.m. The flickering gas lamp casts shadows on the peeling wallpaper of his tiny rented room. Outside, the city is just beginning to stir. As John hurries down the cobblestone streets, the air is thick with the acrid smell of coal smoke and the pungent aroma of horse manure. The clip-clop of hooves and the distant whistle of a steam engine break the early morning silence. John's stomach growls, reminding him of the tough choices ahead. 12 hours of back-breaking labor await him at the factory. The deafening roar of machinery, the suffocating heat, and the ever-present danger of injury are John's constant companions. But he can't afford to complain. At 15 cents an hour, this job is his lifeline. As the sun begins to set, John's exhausted frame shuffles out of the factory gates. His weekly paycheck feels light in his calloused hands. Now comes the real challenge, making those hard-earned dollars stretch. John's first stop is the local bakery. The smell of fresh bread makes his mouth water, but he hesitates. That nickel could go towards his rent, or his dream of owning a house someday. After a moment's deliberation, his growling stomach wins out. He parts with his precious nickel for a loaf that will have to last the week. Back in his cramped room, John pulls out a tattered notebook, his budget. With painstaking care, he allocates his meager earnings. $5 for rent, $2 for food, $1 for clothes. It doesn't leave much room for extras, let alone savings. But John is determined. He scrutinizes every expense, looking for ways to squeeze out a few more cents. Maybe he can mend his work boots instead of buying new ones this month. Perhaps he can trade some labor for a neighbor's vegetable scraps to supplement his diet. As John tallies up his expenses, a small smile creeps across his face. Against all odds, he's managed to set aside 50 cents this week. It's not much, but it's a start. At this rate, how long until he can afford that $3,000 house he dreams of? The math is daunting, but John refuses to give up hope. John's story isn't just about pinching pennies, though. It's about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about holding on to dreams when reality seems determined to crush them. As John blows out his candle and settles onto his lumpy mattress, he allows himself a moment of pride. He's one step closer to his goal, however small that step may be. Tomorrow, he'll wake up and do it all over again, because that's what it takes to turn dreams into reality in 1900s America. Ready to have your mind blown about those cheap prices in 1900? Let's dive into John's world and see if life was really the bargain we think it was. Remember how John's earning 15 cents an hour at the factory? Sounds pretty low compared to today's minimum wage, right? Well, hold on to your wallets, because we're about to crunch some numbers that'll make your eyes pop. Let's start with that dream house John's saving up for. At $3,000, it might seem like a steal. But wait a second. John's yearly income, working those brutal 12-hour days, 6 days a week, comes to just $468. That means his dream home costs more than 6 years of his entire salary. To put that in perspective, today's median home price is typically about 3 to 4 times the median yearly income. Suddenly, John's house doesn't look so affordable, does it? But what about those everyday items? Surely they were a bargain, right? Well, let's take a closer look at that nickel loaf of bread John picks up on his way home. 5 cents might not sound like much, but it's actually a whopping 2.5% of John's daily wage. Want to know what that would feel like today? Imagine paying $5 for a loaf of bread on minimum wage. Not exactly the deal of the century, is it? And it's not just bread. Everything John buys takes a bigger bite out of his paycheck than we might expect. That dozen eggs for 22 cents? It's over 10% of his daily earnings. A gallon of milk at 14 cents might quench his thirst, but it's draining his wallet too. Even that penny newspaper adds up when you're pinching every cent. So, if everything was so expensive, how did people like John manage to get by? Well, it wasn't easy. Many families had to rely on multiple income sources just to make ends meet. Kids often had to pitch in, working odd jobs after school or even dropping out to help support the family. Frugal living wasn't just a trendy lifestyle choice, it was a necessity. And remember, there were no safety nets back then. No unemployment insurance, no Social Security, no Medicare. If you got sick or lost your job, you were pretty much on your own. That $3,000 house John's dreaming of? It wasn't just a goal. It was a form of security in a world with very few guarantees. But here's the kicker. Even with all these high prices, life in 1900 wasn't necessarily worse off than today. It was just different. People had different expectations, different priorities. They made do with less, repaired instead of replaced, and found joy in simpler pleasures. A nickel Coca-Cola was a treat, not an everyday indulgence. A $2.50 pair of shoes was an investment, carefully maintained to last as long as possible. The truth is, when we look at those old price tags and feel a twinge of nostalgia, we're missing the bigger picture. Life in 1900 wasn't cheaper. It was just as challenging in its own way as life today. The costs were different, but the struggle to make ends meet and build a better future, that's something John would recognize in any era. Ever wondered how long it would actually take to save up for a house on those old-timey wages? Well, grab your abacus because we're about to crunch some numbers that'll make your head spin. Remember John, our hard-working factory guy from 1900? He's been pinching pennies left and right, dreaming of that $3,000 house. But here's the kicker. At his current savings rate of 50 cents a week, it would take him, wait for it, 115 years to buy that house. Talk about a long-term investment, right? Now, John's no quitter. He's determined to make his American dream a reality. But how? Well, he's got a few options on the table. He could try to land a better-paying job, but those weren't exactly growing on trees back then. He could cut his expenses even more, but let's be real. He's already living on breadcrumbs. Or he could do what many folks did back in those days, work himself to the bone. And that's exactly what John decides to do. He takes on a second job, pushing himself to the limit. Now, instead of his already grueling 12-hour factory shift, he's working a whopping 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Can you imagine? That's 96 hours of work every week. Picture John dragging himself home each night, his hands calloused and his back aching. He's so exhausted he can barely keep his eyes open for dinner. But he keeps pushing, driven by that vision of a place to call his own. To really tighten his belt, John makes the heartbreaking decision to give up his one little luxury, his weekly 5-cent Coca-Cola. It might not sound like much to us, but for John, that fizzy treat was his one moment of indulgence in a week full of sweat and struggle. But all this sacrifice starts to pay off. Instead of saving just 50 cents a week, John's now squirreling away a whole $2. It might not sound like much to our modern ears, but for John, it's a fortune. His savings are growing 4 times faster than before. So, is all this backbreaking work and penny pinching enough to make John's dream come true? Well, let's do the math. At $2 a week, it would take John about 28 years to save up $3,000. That's assuming house prices don't go up. Spoiler alert, they usually do. It's a far cry from 115 years, but still, that's more than a quarter of a century of non-stop hustling. Now, you might be thinking, surely there's got to be a better way, and you're right to wonder. Many workers in 1900 found themselves in John's shoes, trying to squeeze more hours out of the day to make ends meet. It wasn't uncommon for laborers to clock in 60-hour weeks. Some loggers even worked up to 16 hours a day, just like our pal John. But this kind of grind came at a steep price. Workers faced exhaustion from these demanding schedules. They sacrifice their health, their personal time, and often their relationships in pursuit of a better life. John's days of rest and relaxation? Pretty much non-existent now. When we compare John's situation to today, it really puts things in perspective. These days, home prices are often several times the median annual income. But back in 1900, that $3,000 house was still a mountain to climb for the average worker. It required years of diligent saving and sacrifice, way more than most of us could imagine today. So, what does all this number crunching tell us about life in 1900? Well, it shows us that the good old days weren't always so good. Sure, things might have seemed cheaper on the surface, but when you dig into the details, you realize just how tough people had it. As we wrap up John's journey, it's time for a reality check. Despite their best efforts, many workers like John never reached that coveted American dream of home ownership. But here's the kicker. The concept of the American dream has evolved over time. It's not just about owning a house anymore. These days, it's more about personal fulfillment and opportunities. So, let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Sure, we might complain about our Wi-Fi being slow or our favorite coffee shop running out of oat milk, but compared to John's era, we've got it pretty sweet. But here's a question to chew on. What would you be willing to give up to achieve your dreams? Would you work 16-hour days like John? Skip your daily latte? It's food for thought, isn't it?